I turn the whole thing round and look at it not from the United States perspective, but from the perspective of the Al-Qaeda movement. The origins of that very quickly go back to the Afghan conflict in the 1980s, when the numerous mujahideen had fought against the Soviet occupation. Very much nationalist, but with quite strong religious elements. Predecessors of the Taliban, people who were very almost puritanical in their beliefs, were very significant in that conflict. There were many others coming from outside, but there were many who saw it almost as a religious duty to evict the Soviets from this Islamic land. And essentially towards the end of the 1980s, there was a belief among many of the Mujahideen leaders that not only were they succeeding, they were actually crippling the superpower. But meanwhile, this movement, this Al-Qaeda movement, was developing. It was responsible for some attacks on US troops within Saudi Arabia. Later in the decade, you had the embassy bombings, you had the attack on the USS Cole, and other examples. From Al-Qaeda's perspective, how would you describe it? I think essentially you see it as a transnational revolutionary movement, unusually rooted in a religious rather than a political belief or a nationalist belief. So that makes it rare among revolutionary movements in that, in a sense, it is eschatological. It looks beyond this life to the hereafter, which means the timescales for what it seeks to achieve can be much longer than human lifespans. That's something which is rarely, I think, appreciated in the West. So that Al-Qaeda does have specific short-term and long-term goals. The short-term ones are very straightforward: evict Crusader forces from the heartland of the Islamic world, particularly Saudi Arabia. That was actually achieved in an indirect way 4 or 5 years ago, because the United States did finally withdraw all its uniformed troops, and I think about 2006. The last big base, the Prince Sultan Air Force Base, went on to care and maintenance about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. But beyond that, the Al-Qaeda movement sees the House of Saud as the unacceptable, corrupt, and entirely grossly wealthy, unacceptable keeper of the two holy places. That must be replaced by the proper kind of Islamist regime. So what was the position in the Al-Qaeda leadership when the group that was basically been based in Frankfurt had the idea of attacking the far enemy? The far enemy, the United States with all its influence in the region; the near enemy, the more local regimes. That is the way basically it is talked about. Attacking the far enemy with this extraordinary plan to turn planes into flying bombs, from the Al-Qaeda perspective, seemed to have two quite clear aims. One was to demonstrate the extraordinary power of this movement. It could strike right in the heartland of the United States. We know there were 4 planes. There might have been a 5th one, which was never able to take off. Let's not sure about that. And it is probable the original set of targets were the Twin Towers, the White House, the Pentagon, and the Capitol. In fact, it was the Twin Towers and the Pentagon that was hit. There was a suspicion that there was a target in the State Department in Foggy Bottom, which was actually evacuated within minutes of the plane hitting the Pentagon. But there's a widespread belief, which I think I largely share, that there was a second aim, and that was actually to draw the United States forces into Afghanistan, to bring them to the Al-Qaeda's kind of home territory. And this was rooted in the way in which the movement was part of the process which had actually crippled the Soviet Union, in their view. That may be an exaggeration, but from their perspective, they'd actually crippled a superpower, bring in the next one, and wear it down however long it takes. So that, I think, was the two sides of the coin, 9/11. One other thing to remember is that immediately after 9/11, the Bush administration had very strong support across the Western world. I think it was the French liberal newspaper Le Monde, the rough Paris equivalent of The Guardian, which had it its front page headline on September the 12th, "We are all Americans now." There was a lot of support immediately for the Bush administration, given what had happened, at least support for the American people. The first is that the US forces, and the others, but mainly the US forces, the Marines and the Army, were taking really severe casualties. And you know, many young people, mostly men but some women, were getting killed. And at the same time, there were horrendous injuries. Huge improvements in battlefield medicine, combined with much more body armour, actually meant that far more people were surviving with grievous wounds. In modern conventional warfare, there used to be a rule of thumb: for every person killed, 3 were seriously injured. In Iraq in 2003, for every American killed, 7 or so were seriously injured. And they were face, throat, groin and limb injuries. And many people were basically maimed for life. Now, these were young soldiers and Marines who were facing an urban insurgency for which they were not really trained. And inevitably, what was the one advantage they had? Overwhelming firepower. And this was used repeatedly. And that, of course, meant there were inevitably many civilian casualties, which stirred up even more bitter anti-Americanism. You go back to the early part of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union had been, as some people would say, consigned to the dustbin of history. Bill Clinton appointed a new head of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. The new director of CIA was a guy called James Woolsey. And Woolsey, as is the American system, then had to be subject to examination by the Senate for approval of his appointment. And one senator asked Woolsey, how would you characterize the change from the Cold War to the post-Cold War world? And Woolsey replied, I would look at it this way: we've slain the dragon, but we now live in a jungle full of poisonous snakes. And in one sense, I think the response to 9/11, while understandable, was basically taming the jungle. It was old thinking. It was almost reminiscent of the Cold War era. There was the inability to get behind why this Al-Qaeda group existed, where it was coming from, why it got it the support it got. And essentially that is still the case now. It was seen as a military problem requiring a military solution coupled with very extensive counter-terrorism development. It did not go to the root. The word I've invented for that kind of attitude is lidism. You keep a lid on things rather than going underneath and seeing what the problems are. And in some ways, I think that is the very bad, awful lesson of what has happened over the 9 years. Whether we're learning from that really remains to be seen. But what I would say is that all the signs are that the really major world security problems over the next 20 or 30 years are going to stem much more from things like climate change and the widening wealth-poverty divide.